I didn't believe in romance. I believed in calluses, crippling debt, and simple survival. My marriage was just a notarized piece of paper meant to save a dying ranch, completely untouched and unloved. Then came the dust, the sweat, and the quiet, heavy stare of a man who decided I was entirely done hiding. The coffee tasted like scorched earth. I poured it down the sink and watched the brown sludge stain the porcelain. Everything in this house felt broken, including me. It had been 4 months since David died. We were married for 3 years. If you looked at the legal documents in the county clerk's office, I was a grieving widower, the sole inheritor of the sprawling, debt-ridden Oak Haven ranch. If you looked at the reality, I was a 28-year-old glorified nursemaid who had traded his 20s for a roof over his head. David was 64 when his heart finally gave out. He had needed someone to manage his pills, cook his meals, and pretend to the town that he wasn't dying alone. I had needed an escape from a life in the city that was slowly grinding my bones to dust. We slept in separate rooms. We never kissed. I was a virgin in every sense of the word that mattered, wrapped in a wedding band that felt more like a shackle than a promise. Now David was buried on the hill past the lower pasture, and I was left with 200 head of cattle, a mountain of overdue bank notices, and Wyatt. The screen door slammed shut, rattling in its frame. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. "Tractor's dead," Wyatt said. His voice was gravel and low, the kind of sound that vibrated in the floorboards before it reached your ears. I turned around, leaning against the kitchen counter. Wyatt stood in the entryway, tracking mud onto the faded linoleum. He was 32, built like a brick wall, and entirely too much for this small kitchen. His denim jacket was frayed at the cuffs, stained with grease and dirt. Underneath it, a faded thermal shirt clung to his chest. He took off his Stetson, running a calloused hand through thick, sweat-dampened dark hair. "What do you mean, it's dead?" I asked. I hated how my voice sounded. Too thin, too frantic. "Means the alternator finally gave out. Like I told David it would 6 months ago. Like I told you last week." Wyatt didn't sound angry. He sounded tired and indifferent. That was worse. "Can you fix it?" I asked, crossing my arms over my chest to hide the way my hands were trembling. Wyatt looked at me. Really looked at me. It wasn't a glance. It was an assessment. He took in my clean jeans, my uncalloused hands, the dark circles under my eyes. He had worked for David for a decade. He knew exactly what our marriage was. He knew I didn't know the first thing about running a ranch. I was a paper owner, an imposter wearing dead man's boots. "I can," Wyatt said slowly, tossing his hat onto the hook by the door. "But I need parts from town, and we've got 50 feet of downed fence on the south ridge that needs mending before the herd finds it. I can't be in 2 places." "I'll do the fence," I said. The words were out of my mouth before my brain could stop them. Wyatt paused. He was halfway to the coffee pot. He turned his head, his dark eyes narrowing. "You." "Yes, me," I snapped, pushing off the counter. "I know how to use a hammer. I'm not useless." Wyatt let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. He didn't argue. He just poured himself a cup of the fresh coffee I had finally managed to brew correctly, took a sip, and nodded. "Post hole digger is in the shed. Wire stretchers are in the back of the truck. Good luck." 2 hours later, I was ready to quit. The Wyoming sun was a relentless weight on my shoulders. My lower back screamed in protest with every strike of the post driver. The ground was hard, packed clay that refused to yield. My hands were already blistered, the cheap leather gloves I'd found in the shed doing nothing to protect my skin from the friction. I cursed David. I cursed the cows. I cursed myself for thinking I could just step into this life and make it work through sheer willpower. I was trying to stretch a line of barbed wire, my muscles straining to the point of tearing, when the wire slipped. The tension snapped back. The rusty barb slashed across my forearm, slicing through my flannel shirt and biting deep into my skin. I dropped the tools with a sharp hiss of pain, clutching my arm. Blood welled up instantly, hot and sticky, soaking into the fabric. "God damn it," I muttered, gritting my teeth. "Let go of it." I flinched. I hadn't heard the truck pull up. Wyatt was standing 3 feet away, a coil of fresh wire slung over his shoulder. He dropped the wire in the dirt and stepped into my space. The smell of him, diesel fuel, sweat, and pine suddenly overpowered the dusty air. "I'm fine," I lied, stepping back. Wyatt didn't listen. He reached out and wrapped his large, rough hand around my wrist. His grip was entirely unyielding. He pulled my arm forward, rolling up the torn flannel sleeve to inspect the cut. His fingers were incredibly warm against my cold skin. I stared at his hands. They were battered, scarred, permanently stained with the dirt of the land. My breath hitched, a sudden, unfamiliar heat pooling low in my stomach. It was purely a biological reaction, I told myself. Adrenaline, shock from the cut. "It's not deep," Wyatt muttered, his thumb brushing dangerously close to the bleeding edge. "But you need to clean it. Tetanus is an ugly way to die." I couldn't look away from his face. He was so close I could see the individual stubble on his jaw, the harsh lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. "I said I'm fine," I repeated, but my voice lacked any real conviction. Wyatt finally looked up from my arm. His eyes met mine, and the world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. He didn't drop my wrist. Instead, his thumb moved, just a fraction of an inch, stroking the sensitive skin on the inside of my forearm. "You're bleeding, Arthur," he said softly, using my name for the first time since David's funeral. "Go back to the house. I'll finish this." He let go of me and turned back to the fence. I stood there for a long, pathetic moment, feeling the phantom pressure of his fingers burning into my skin, before I finally turned and walked away. The tension between us shifted after that day. It wasn't spoken about, it wasn't acknowledged, but it was there, hanging in the air of the farmhouse, like the heavy, suffocating pressure right before a thunderstorm. We started eating dinner together. Before, Wyatt would take his plate to the porch or eat in the bunkhouse, giving me a wide, resentful berth. Now, he sat across from me at the small wooden table in the kitchen. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was dense, packed tightly with questions neither of us knew how to ask. I caught him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I felt his eyes on the back of my neck when I washed the dishes. I hated it. I hated the way it made my heart hammer against my ribs. I was a cynic. I didn't believe in sudden, overwhelming connections. I had married an old man for practical reasons because I believed love was a luxury for people with trust funds. Yet, every time Wyatt brushed past me in the narrow hallway, every time our hands accidentally grazed when he handed me a wrench or a coffee mug, my entire body went rigid with a desperate, pathetic hunger. A week later, the storm finally broke. It started as a low rumble over the mountains around 3 in the afternoon. By 6, the sky was a bruised, violent purple, and the rain was falling in sheets so thick you couldn't see the barn from the house. "We need to check the south stalls," Wyatt yelled over the deafening roar of the wind, bursting through the front door. He was already soaked to the bone, water pouring off his hat. "The roof is old. If it caves, the horses are dead." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my slicker and boots, following him out into the deluge. The cold hit me like a physical blow. The mud sucked at my boots, threatening to pull me down with every step. The wind was a physical force, shoving me sideways. I kept my eyes on Wyatt's broad back, trusting him to navigate the darkness. We reached the barn. Inside, the noise of the storm was slightly muted, replaced by the panicked whinnying of the horses. The ceiling was groaning, water pouring steadily through several large leaks in the corrugated metal. "Grab the halters," Wyatt commanded, pointing to the wall. "We have to move them to the lower barn." We worked in frantic, desperate sync. I led a terrified mare out into the driving rain, my boots sliding violently in the mud. I couldn't see anything. I just pulled, shouting useless comforts to an animal that couldn't hear me over the thunder. By the time we got the last horse secured in the structurally sound lower barn, I was exhausted. My muscles shook uncontrollably. I was freezing, my clothes plastered to my skin, my teeth chattering so hard my jaw ached. We locked the heavy wooden doors, trapping ourselves inside the dry, hay-scented dimness of the tack room. A single flickering bulb cast long shadows across the floor. I slumped against the wall, sliding down until I hit the floorboards, pulling my knees to my chest. I couldn't stop shaking. It wasn't just the cold, it was the adrenaline crashing, leaving me hollowed out and completely fragile. Wyatt stood in the center of the room. He took off his ruined hat and tossed it aside. He unbuttoned his soaked jacket, stripping it off and dropping it to the floor. Underneath, his t-shirt was entirely transparent, clinging to the hard lines of his chest and abdomen. He looked at me. His chest heaved with heavy breaths. "You're freezing," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I'll survive," I managed to say, though my teeth clacked together, audibly. Wyatt shook his head. He walked over to a metal cabinet in the corner and pulled out a heavy, scratchy wool emergency blanket. He walked back to me and crouched down, his knees popping in the quiet room. "Stand up," he ordered quietly. I didn't have the strength to argue. I pushed myself up the wall, my legs trembling. Wyatt draped the heavy blanket over my shoulders. He didn't step back. He stayed close, his hands gripping the edges of the blanket near my collarbone. "You did good tonight," he said. His voice was lower than usual, almost a vibration against my own chest. "Most city boys would have hid under the bed." "I'm not a city boy anymore," I whispered. "No," Wyatt agreed softly. "You're not." He let go of the blanket and reached down, gripping the hem of my soaked slicker. "Take this off. It's keeping the cold against your skin." I was paralyzed. I couldn't raise my arms. Wyatt didn't wait for permission. He unzipped the jacket himself, his knuckles dragging lightly against my chest. He pulled it off my shoulders, tossing it aside. He did the same with my wet flannel shirt, leaving me in nothing but a damp undershirt and the wool blanket. His hands were moving with rough efficiency, but there was a devastating gentleness beneath it. When he finished, he didn't pull away. He rested his hands lightly on my waist. The heat radiating from his body was an anchor. I looked up into his face. His eyes were dark, intense, stripping away every defense I had spent 28 years building. "David never touched you," Wyatt said. It was a statement of absolute fact. I swallowed hard, feeling incredibly exposed. "No, it was a contract. You're 28 years old, Arthur." Wyatt's thumb brushed the skin just above my hip bone, sending a violent shockwave straight down my spine. And you've never been touched. I know, I breathed, my voice breaking. I felt tears prick my eyes, born of exhaustion, cold, and a sudden, overwhelming shame. You don't have to point out how pathetic it is. Pathetic? Wyatt's grip on my waist tightened, pulling me a fraction of an inch closer. Our thighs brushed. I don't think it's pathetic. I think it's a goddamn waste. He moved one hand up, his rough, calloused palm cupping the side of my neck. His thumb stroked my jawline. The contrast between his harsh, calloused skin and the terrifying tenderness of his touch shattered the last of my resolve. I leaned into his hand, a small, involuntary sound escaping my throat. Wyatt's gaze dropped to my lips. The air in the small tack room felt suddenly non-existent. You've been holding yourself together for too long, Wyatt murmured, his face inches from mine, his breath hot across my cheek. He leaned in, his lips brushing against my ear. The cowboy whispered, "I'll take all of you tonight." When his mouth finally came down on mine, the impact rattled my teeth. It wasn't a cinematic kiss. It was a collision of freezing exhaustion meeting something dark and hungry that had been starving in the quiet corners of this ranch. I gasped, and Wyatt took the surrender instantly. His tongue swept along my lower lip, tasting of black coffee, rain, and salt. My hands, numb from the freezing mud, instinctively curled into his damp undershirt. I held on like a drowning man. 28 years of carefully constructed walls, of telling myself that physical intimacy was a transactional currency I didn't possess, shattered under the heavy, bruised pressure of his mouth. Wyatt walked me backward until my spine hit the rough wooden planks of the tack room wall. The contrast was maddening. My skin was icy under the scratchy wool, but everywhere Wyatt touched me felt like a branding iron. His calloused palm slid down my bare chest, his rough skin dragging over my ribs with a friction that pulled a broken sound from the back of my throat. "Breathe, Arthur," he muttered against my jaw. I couldn't. Wyatt's hands were methodical and entirely assured. He didn't treat me like fragile glass. He treated me like a man. He dragged the wool blanket off my shoulders, letting it drop to the dusty floorboards. Then he grabbed the hem of his own soaked shirt and pulled it over his head in one sharp motion. Without another word, he gripped my hips and pulled me down with him onto the heavy canvas feed bags piled in the corner. It smelled of sweet feed, wet leather, and dust. Every touch was a revelation. I was clumsy, my hands shaking as I reached for his heavy silver belt buckle, but Wyatt was a picture of terrifying patience. He taught me the brutal, simple mechanics of wanting and being wanted in return. The initial pain was a sharp tearing sensation, but it was eclipsed instantly by a profound, overwhelming fullness. I dug my short fingernails into the thick muscle of his shoulders, burying my face in the crook of his neck to muffle a raw cry. Wyatt stopped moving. He held himself completely still, his muscles trembling with restraint. He pressed his forehead against mine. "Look at me," he commanded softly. I blinked away the stinging moisture. "You're okay. I've got you." "Don't stop," I choked out, a cynical city boy reduced to begging in a freezing barn. "Please, Wyatt." He didn't. The rhythm he set was punishing and perfect, grounding me in the physical reality of sweat and friction. For the first time in my life, my perpetually terrified brain went silent. There were no bank loans, no dead husbands. There was only the rough wood behind my head and the immense gravity of the man above me, When it finally broke, it broke me entirely. I shattered, sobbing silently into his shoulder as the aftershocks racked my exhausted body. We lay there for hours, wrapped in the discarded wool blanket, listening to the rain hammer the tin roof until the storm bled itself dry. Morning brought the sharp light of reality. I woke up in my own bed. Wyatt had carried me through the mud, stripped my ruined clothes, and put me under the quilt. The space beside me was empty, the sheets cold. Sitting up, my lower back ached with a heavy throb. As I stared at the peeling wallpaper, the suffocating cloak of my cynicism wrapped around my throat. What had I done? I had slept with my dead husband's ranch hand. I had let exhaustion and pathetic loneliness manipulate me. Wyatt wasn't a savior. He was an employee needing a paycheck. My mind raced, building defenses out of paranoia. I dressed mechanically, preparing my speech. A moment of weakness. We would be professionals. I walked into the kitchen and stopped dead. Wyatt was standing at the stove, a frying pan sizzling with bacon. He had showered. He wore clean denim and a faded gray thermal. He didn't look like a man who regretted a mistake. He looked terrifyingly at home. He turned around, a spatula in his hand. He took one look at my face, at the rigid line of my shoulders, and sighed. "Don't," Wyatt said, pointing the spatula at me. "Don't what?" My voice was thin. "Don't put the armor back on," he said, turning the burner off. "I can see the gears turning. You're trying to figure out how to frame last night as a tactical error. You're trying to convince yourself I pity you." I swallowed hard. "I'm your boss, Wyatt. It crosses a line." Wyatt let out a harsh laugh. He dropped the spatula, crossed the linoleum in 3 long strides, and stopped inches from me. "You haven't been my boss a day in your life," Wyatt said, his voice dropping low, vibrating with certainty. "You're a man who inherited a sinking ship, and I'm the guy bailing water with you. Last night wasn't pity. It was me taking what we've both been staring at for 4 months." He reached up, his rough fingers tracing the dark circle under my eye. I couldn't pull away. "I'm not David," Wyatt whispered, the harshness fading into raw truth. "I'm not going to leave you alone in this house, and I'm sure as hell not going to let you hide from me." The damage from the storm was brutal. Stepping out onto the porch after breakfast felt like looking at a war zone. The sky was a painfully clear, mocking blue, illuminating exactly how much trouble we were in. The wind had ripped 1/3 of the shingles off the main barn. A massive cottonwood had splintered near the creek, taking out 80 feet of pristine lodgepole fencing. The lower pasture, where we needed to move the cattle next week, was a flooded swamp of thick, churning mud. I stood next to Wyatt on the top step, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. The silence between us wasn't tense anymore. It was heavy with the shared weight of impending failure. "We need a contractor for the roof," I said, doing the mental math and feeling a cold spike of panic in my chest. "And heavy machinery to move that tree. The tractor is still dead, Wyatt. We can't drag it with the truck. It'll rip the axle out." Wyatt didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the horizon, his jaw set in a hard, stubborn line. "Contractors take cash up front, Arthur. And the bank called yesterday while you were fixing the porch railing. They're giving us 30 days to make the back payments on the mortgage or they initiate foreclosure." The word hit me like a physical blow. Foreclosure. Everything I had traded my 20s for, the suffocating marriage, the isolation, the grueling physical labor, it was all going to be wiped out by a bank executive in a clean suit. I let out a bitter, humorless laugh, kicking a loose pebble off the porch. "So that's it then," I said, my cynical defenses springing back to life. "I sell the herd at a massive loss to cover the immediate debt, pack my bags, and go back to a cramped apartment in Denver. You find another ranch to work. We brush our hands and walk away." Wyatt finally turned his head. His eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine anger sparking in the dark brown depths. He grabbed my upper arm, his grip tight enough to bruise, and hauled me around to face him. "Did you hear a single word I said in the kitchen?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "I didn't break my back on this land for 10 years just to watch you hand the keys to the bank because you got scared of some mud and a fallen tree." "It's not just mud, Wyatt," I shouted, the panic finally breaking through my carefully controlled exterior. I shoved at his chest, but he didn't budge. "It's $70,000 in arrears. It's a dead tractor. I am entirely out of my depth, and I am dragging you down with me." Wyatt absorbed my outburst without flinching. When I finally ran out of breath, my chest heaving, he simply let go of my arm. He reached into the back pocket of his mud-stained jeans and pulled out a battered leather wallet. He flipped it open, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and shoved it into my chest. I took it reflexively, unfolding it with shaking hands. It was a bank statement, a personal savings account under the name Wyatt Cole. The balance at the bottom made my breath hitch. It wasn't enough to buy a private island, but it was enough. More than enough. $42,000, I breathed, staring at the ink as if it might disappear. I looked up at him, entirely bewildered. "Wyatt, you make $1,200 a month. How?" "I don't drink, I don't gamble, and I've lived in a bunkhouse with no rent for a decade," Wyatt said flatly. "I was saving for my own piece of land." "Then you need to keep it," I said, instantly, trying to shove the paper back at him. "This is your out. You can buy a starter plot in Montana. You can't waste this on a failing ranch that belongs to a dead man." Wyatt didn't take the paper. He stepped closer, crowding me against the porch railing. He boxed me in, placing his heavy hands on the wood on either side of my hips. "The ranch doesn't belong to a dead man anymore, Arthur," Wyatt said softly, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my knees feel weak. "It belongs to you, and I don't want a starter plot in Montana. I want this land, and I want the man standing on it." I stared at him, the cynical, damaged part of my brain desperately looking for the trap. People didn't just hand over their life savings. People didn't look at a broken, inexperienced paper owner and see a partner. But looking into Wyatt's face, I saw nothing but the harsh, unyielding truth of the Wyoming dirt. He meant every single word. "You're a fool," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Probably," Wyatt agreed, leaning in until his forehead rested against mine. "But I'm a fool who knows how to fix a tractor alternator and rebuild a lodgepole fence. The bank gets a check on Monday. The rest goes to lumber and a new roof. We do the labor ourselves. It's going to suck. It's going to be cold, miserable work, and you're going to complain the entire time." "I don't complain," I muttered, sliding my hands up his chest, tangling my fingers in the soft fabric of his thermal shirt. Wyatt chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated straight through my bones. "You do, but I'll make sure you're entirely too tired to talk by the time we go to bed." He kissed me then. It wasn't the desperate, frantic collision of the night before in the freezing tack room. It was slow, deliberate, and deeply possessive. It was a promise forged in sweat and impending debt. When he pulled away, he dragged his thumb across my lower lip, his eyes tracing my face as if memorizing the lines. "Go get your work gloves, city boy," Wyatt ordered, stepping back and turning toward the mud-soaked yard. "We've got a tree to move." I watched his broad back as he walked down the steps. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel the suffocating weight of the empty sky pressing down on me. I folded his bank statement, tucked it safely into my pocket, and went inside to find my boots. The debt was still there. The ranch was still broken. But as I pulled on my leather gloves, feeling the sting of the healing blisters on my palms, I realized I wasn't surviving anymore. I was finally living.